Qumran. So the worship of Yahweh or Jehovah was supported the same way for thousands of years through voluntary contributions. Who are these ugly creatures? Well, obviously the one in the forefront is a fertility symbol. Anybody know her name? Asherah, exactly. And behind that's her seated, and that's her husband's son. Interestingly. See, Jesus never married his mother, but in demonology, you always have mommy marrying the son. Anybody know her son's name? Baal. That's Baal. Unimpressive, right? Yeah, it doesn't even look impressive. Now, if you look at Asherah, what servant of Jehovah left the worship of Jehovah to worship this? Solomon, the wisest man in all the earth, left the worship of Jehovah, the living God, for the little busty tree lady there. So I don't know what happened with the wisdom, but he must have lost it. Now, interestingly, they took these little figurines and they would take them into the temple, even of Jehovah, and practice all kind of lewd acts with it. You can see why he was upset with them. They should have known better. If you look at Baal, you can see that he's actually in a dress. Can you make that out? Yeah, he's a cross-dressing god. I'm not making this up. So how did you go to a Baal party? Yeah, the men went dressed as women, the women went dressed as men. Can you see who was encouraging that sort of behavior? Exactly. Jehovah's never going to accept that. So again, a little close-up of Baal in his dress. Anybody know who this doggy giraffe looking guy is? I'm sorry? No, we're in Babylon now. Close, another M word. Somebody said Marmaduke. I don't think he was back then, but you're very close. Actually, it's Marduk or Merodach. Now, take a good look. No, you're good. Yeah. Where do you see him on the walls there? Well, actually, all along the walls. So now we can go back. Who would have seen the very brick that you're looking at here? Because these are not replicas. These are from Babylon's processional way. So who would have saw this? Exactly. It's scary to see something that you know that a Bible character saw, because those are not replicas. They're on loan from the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. So again, Daniel. Now, this is a restoration. Anybody know who tried to restore Babylon? Saddam Hussein. And actually, I just got these a couple of, well, actually, maybe yesterday. Actually, a soldier sent it to one of, we obtained them, I'll just put it that way. And this is before the war. And what's interesting is Saddam Hussein tried to do what the Bible said he wasn't going to do. Who else tried to rebuild Babylon? Exactly, Alexander the Great. So what happened to him, right? So Saddam didn't fare too good. So you see this soldier there, this is before the war. I don't know if this even still exists after all the bombing that went on over there. And if you read there, the sign says the procession street, the street of the main religious and the new Babylon. Interestingly, they still have a procession street named after processional way that was in the scriptures. Another fertility goddess. I thought that was a dart at first, but then that's supposed to be her hips. Yeah, it looks a little funny. What do you see around the waist? Just in between the waist and the, yeah. Circles. You might have had them for breakfast this morning. He said Cheerios? Eggs. What are eggs? Fertility symbols, exactly. So her name is Ishtar. If you say it in Semitic dialect, Istar. Yeah, so the Easter eggs. So we start to understand where these holidays came from. Interestingly, who started this country again? This time it's not the Masons. Who started America? She said Satan. Okay, and what were they? They were English people, but what were they? The Puritans, right? They're supposed to be Christians. So what two holidays did they refuse to celebrate for the first 200 years? Christmas and Easter. In fact, if you go to colonial Williamsburg, you will not see any scenes of Christmas. The Puritans didn't celebrate it. So if we have young people, it's good for them to understand this, because maybe you go to school and they say, hey, why don't you paint the little Easter egg? What do you not want to say to them? What's a bad answer? Well, I consider a bad answer to be, I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses. It doesn't tell them anything. They think you're brainwashed. But if you tell them, if you go to the Encyclopedia Americana or Britannica and look up the Puritans, you'll see that they didn't celebrate those holidays either. They go home, they do the research, they realize you're not brainwashed, and they see it's the truth. So it's a good answer, because then you stand up for your faith. So Ishtar and Istar. Another same goddess, you can tell it's a fertility symbol, obviously. What are these? Lions, the striding lions of Babylon. Who made Babel a city? Nimrod. But who made Babylon a world power? Nebuchadnezzar. And what did he have to be? Well, he had to be humbled, right? One of the reasons is stuff like this. This is a brick, and actually it's a stamp on it. He was kind of like the Donald Trump of his day. He put his stamp on everything. And so as he was building Babylon, he put it on each brick.
You can see that on the little rock right there.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And this is a seal boasting of his building accomplishments. So you kind of see why Nebuchadnezzar might have been a little haughty. Interestingly, did those Jews know how long they were going to be there when they were going in? Yes. Sometimes we get this wrong, but Daniel was roving about in the prophecies, and he discerned it was only going to be 70 years. What kind of Bible study was Daniel doing? Intense. What kind of Bible study should we be doing? Yeah. We won't understand the times that we're living in if our Bible study is not. In fact, if you look at what's happening in the Middle East now, if you look at the signs in terms of earthquakes, even in the last few months, how they've increased, literally, friends, we're on the clock. This is not the time to be complacent. So things like these help us to realize when we have faith in the scriptures. This is a bowl. It's the bowl of Darius, because remember, Cyrus actually released the Jews, but Darius came after him. And this bowl has inscriptions from Darius the Great on it. And in Babylon, the king was ahead of the law, but in Medo-Persia, the law was ahead of the king. So when Darius, he had already freed the Jews, but they went back, and all of a sudden the temple had been left off, and they needed funds. What did Darius do? He sent them funds in conjunction with what Cyrus did. Then you see this little creature here. What does it look like to you? Yeah, a dragon, but there's a cup behind it. And we can see it from this angle a little bit better. Who was a famous cupbearer in Scripture? Nehemiah. So now the temple had been completed, but the walls and the gates weren't complete. What did Nehemiah do with Artaxerxes, son of Xerxes? Exactly. He was a little sad because a cupbearer, he'd make sure the king doesn't drop dead. He tastes everything. So when Nehemiah wasn't looking too good, what did Artaxerxes say? Yeah, what's going on, Nehemiah? Nehemiah said a quick prayer. So 3 Persian kings, Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, all helped to restore the worship of Jehovah, even though they weren't worshipers of Jehovah. They were worshipers of Ahura Mazda, a Zoroastrian deity. So what does that tell us? He's always in control, and we should remember that even today, even in this land of the free. So we're basically at the end. We just gave you a taste of what goes on there at the museum. It's a little bit more detailed. You can turn them on, but slowly. Thank you. I know it might have been a while to sit through in the dark, but hopefully it's built your faith up. People go through the museum and they see these things, but for us they're not things. They're testaments to the fact that the scriptures are true, that Jehovah lives, and that his word, his prophecies are going to come true. So when we see these things, they just really build our faith up, and hopefully it's done that for you today. We're going to close out with a song. I actually forget which song I think it's 65. And if we could all stand and sing in appreciation.
So now let's give our undivided attention to Brother Miller as he speaks on the theme, the origin of humans. Does it matter what you believe?
Do they matter? Our thoughts, our beliefs, do they matter? Well, those who study the brain have established that there are solid links between human thought and the actions that follow. In fact, the choices that we make the behaviors that we embrace, emerge out of our thoughts, our belief system. Would you say that your thoughts about the existential origins of humanity, or how we came to be here, have impacted your behavior? Have beliefs about humanity's origin influenced them in general? Well, we'll examine these issues today in detail. First of all, there's various beliefs about our origin. You might remember Charles Darwin from school, that name. He popularized something called Origin of the Species. It was a publication he put out in 1859, and he set this forth in that publication. In an ongoing struggle for dominance, nature selects the fittest organisms to survive, imparting new and beneficial features to these over time so that they slowly evolve into higher organisms. If you are familiar with evolution, though, you know that's not the only theory. In fact, it's safe to say that most scientists today don't accept Charles Darwin's version of evolution. They found many holes in it, and so they keep recreating this doctrine, as it were. So here's another one. We're going to get through this together. It's called punctuated equilibrium. That theory says species generally maintain their equilibrium or balance. However, during certain periods, jumps or punctuations take place wherein rapid evolution occurs. Now, for any theory on evolution to be feasible, mutations are needed. That's another word from school. The World Book Encyclopedia calls mutations the basis for evolution, and one web page says this: evolution absolutely depends on mutations because this is the only way that alternative versions of a gene are created. Now, one dictionary defines it as accidental change. Just remember that word, accidental change in an organism. And again, we know from school that the sex or reproductive cells have to be involved. To illustrate, now you don't really need to go down, I normally use sunny Jamaica, but here in South Florida or Southern California, the sun gets pretty hot. So say you're down here at peak season when it's triple temperatures. Well, the numbers kind of getting tripped up here, but it's hot. You get the picture. And say you're living here, maybe you and your wife have a child. Does the child come out with a tan? Now, you may darken in the warm sun, but the child doesn't come out with a tan automatically. There's been a change, but that isn't passed on because the sex or reproductive cells are not involved. Robert Jastrow said there would need to be a slow accumulation of favorable mutations. So if there's favorable mutations, it implies that there are ones that are not favorable. Just to illustrate, sadly, we probably know someone who has Down syndrome. Does that affect them positively or negatively? Well, most of us understand that it has a bad effect on the individual. And actually, that's a mutation. An extra chromosome has been added in. So, right from the outset, we see or agree with the Encyclopedia Americana that most mutations are damaging to the organism. Mutation seems to be a destructive rather than constructive process. In fact, if you know much about, without getting too graphic, the woman's cycle, actually that flow of blood that happens every month is a cleaning because things change, cells mutate, and so to get rid of that, Jehovah has built into the process where her system is cleansed and she has that flow. That way we don't have kids coming out with ears in the wrong places and different things. So Jehovah actually built a protection into the system. There's another theory called ID, or intelligent design, and its supporters reason that nature, or design in nature, suggests that there's a designer, but they don't call him God. In fact, this is the theory that a lot of people want to teach in school. They say that there's this unnamed intelligence and that he actually used evolution to bring you and I about. Now, although this sounds like it's a talk on evolution, it really isn't. It's a talk on the psychological effects of this teaching. So we ask this question. In 1859, when Charles Darwin popularized modern evolution, what did the clergy do? Well, listen to this headline from 1938, New York Times. There it says, no objection to a theory of evolution can be drawn from the two creation narratives, since it's generally agreed among educated Christians that these are mythological in origin and that their value for us is symbolic rather than historical. You can think what you like, and still be Christian. Now imagine that was the church. They were supposed to be upholding the Bible, and they said, we don't really see anything wrong with what Charles Darwin is saying. Let's reference the Bible, though, in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, and let's see what the Bible actually teaches. That's Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27. And as we turn there, remember that the Bible doesn't claim to be a scientific textbook. It doesn't use a lot of scientific terms, but it simply lays out what God says happened at the outset, and from that we can extract truth. Genesis 1 and 27 says, "And God proceeded to create the man in his image. In God's image he created him, male and female he created them." So right from the outset we can get rid of ID or intelligent design. Evolution was not used. We didn't start in the primordial soup and come on the land, get a vertebrate and stand up and turn from reptiles into mammals. No. It says that a first cause, or God, created life. And the fossil record agrees with this because life bounced onto the scene in variety, not slowly from one source. The Bible, like Luke 3:38, refers to Adam as a son of God. Nowhere in the entire scriptural record is that term applied to what man calls lower animal life. So to recap, Darwinian evolution teaches that living things evolve from previous forms of life and that they struggle for existence until a dominant species prevails. Here's the problem with that. Ransom sacrifice, there isn't any, so there's no sin. There's no kingdom hope because this life is all there is, secondly. And thirdly, and most importantly for our discussion, it relieves you and I of moral responsibility to a creator. Now, why is that important? Because what we believe affects what we do. So how have humans been affected by accepting this teaching, this idea that they are higher animals, smart apes, evolving by chance? Let's go back through history. You might remember historian H.G. Wells. He wrote a book called The Outline of History. Within that work, it set this forth. After 1859, that's the year Charles Darwin popularized modern evolution, people believed that they had prevailed by virtue of this struggle for existence in which the cunning, the strong and the cunning, get the better of the weak and confiding. It seemed right to them that the big dogs of the human pack should bully and subdue. Interesting language. It's supposed to be high English, but it's really sick what they're saying. But to go further, you might remember the name Karl Marx. Remember communism came out of Marxism. What did this man, Karl Marx, say after reading Charles Darwin's work? He said, "It serves me as a scientific basis for class struggle in history." So what he's basically saying is, after reading that work, he looked at history and he reinterpreted it. The feudal system, all of these wars, that wasn't immoral. Somebody's always going to be on the top. Somebody's always going to be on the bottom. Guess which one he wanted to be? And he actually authored this economic theory that turned into a political theory that has affected everybody in this room today. Going further, though, Drs. Ankelberg and Weldon wrote a book called Marx and Darwin. They said Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels based their communistic philosophy squarely on the foundation of evolutionism. And we really don't need anyone to tell us about that, because when the Soviet Union was intact, and our brothers, we know what they went through, what's the one thing they didn't tolerate under that form of government? Belief in a creator. You were punished for having belief in a creator, much as you are in communistic China today. Going further, though, Darwinism and the Nazi Race Holocaust by Jerry Bergman says, Darwinism justified and encouraged the Nazis' views on both race and war. Hitler stressed that to produce a better society, they must understand and cooperate with science. Again, high English, but when you know what the Nazis did, it's sick. Actually, what they were saying is we're at the top and everybody else is at the bottom. So we have the right to get rid of them. Now, we may say, well, that's over with. They're gone. But have you ever heard of Planned Parenthood? In fact, we got one in this neighborhood. They showed it to me as we drove around. Actually, the woman who formed that was called Margaret Sanger, and she actually was in league with the Nazis. Whereas the Nazis tried to eliminate people that they thought were inferior, they try to be your friend, and they hand out these little gifts. You know what I'm referring to. And they say it's going to help you. But really what they're actually trying to do is slow down certain segments of society from reproducing. So are we still affected by these theories such as eugenics, which is an attempt to improve inherited attributes of humans by controlling the mating process? Yes, we are. So in view of the historical record, it is evident that this belief system affected politics, economics, social attitudes, and the progression of history itself in the last century. Here's a question. Are you and I part of humanity or simply an intelligent animal, a smart ape? It may seem silly to discuss this in the Kingdom Hall, but for the rest of this discussion, take religion out of it. Because really it's more than just a religious issue. And we've been told if we go to the door, we can't open up the Bible to an evolutionist, because they're not going to want to hear that. Now, why is that question important? Because it affects the way we interpret life. It affects our view of right and wrong. To illustrate, let's take some hot topics of the day. One being abortion. If you believe that a creator gave us life, he's the only one that can give it, and we really shouldn't take it away, we're less inclined to have an abortion. But if we believe that life came about by chance, who are you to tell me what to do with my body? Haven't you heard that when you're talking with people who espouse these ideas? Even further with homosexuality. If one believes that God is the creator, that he set the mold, even if we feel a certain way, we resist it because we understand that we're going outside of the box, so to speak. What about sexual perversion in general? Years ago, you didn't have to tell someone that they shouldn't look to a child for their sexual interests. What do you see outside, though? And this is a direct result of Darwinism, evolutionism, because when you take God out of the equation, you take morality out of the equation. There's a thing also called evolutionary psychology. It links animal and human behavior. So in essence, if we came from them, we should be looking to them for some answers. And so this book called The Moral Animal by Robert Wright says, nature wants men to have relations with an endless series of women. It's literally natural for men to cheat. It's literally what they were born to do. You can go online and look at a book and see what people have said about the book. So I went online, and there was a woman whose husband had cheated on her. So she read this book. She says, you know, I was really distressed, but I didn't know what was going on. But after reading this book, I realized he couldn't help himself. Do you realize what went on, though? See, she read this, and it reshaped her thinking. Now she thinks this is acceptable, that immorality is nothing more than natural. Let's read a scripture that bears on this. It's Colossians chapter 2, and let's look at verse 8. Colossians 2 and 8. And as you read it, think about it this way, that Jehovah is actually talking to you. He's warning you, because it's not like that. Actually, that is the case. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 8. There it says, look out. Perhaps there may be someone who will carry you off as his prey through the what? Philosophy and empty deception of men according to the elementary things of the world. So Jehovah's telling us that philosophies can carry people off, shipwreck their faith. If you're like me, when I was growing up, my mother told me, don't eat everything someone serves to you. She used to say, if you don't know the person, you don't eat. And that kind of stuck with me. And that's actually what Jehovah's telling us. Be careful what we take in mentally, because it affects us. It changes us. He has given us as intelligent creatures the ability to decipher and decide. And what that means is we can look at an issue, examine it, and come to a logical conclusion on the other end. We don't have to be scientists, but there are certain things that will help us see the flaws in this model. If you would look at Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, I'll just briefly read it. It says, for his invisible qualities are clearly seen from the world's creation onward, because they are perceived by the things made, even his eternal power and godship, so that they are inexcusable. So in essence, Jehovah is saying, if you can look at all the complexity in life, the design, not only on the human, on the human side, on the earth, But even in the solar system, all of these things, the fact that the Earth is placed in just the right position in the solar system to survive. You move it, we wouldn't be here because we couldn't survive on this planet. All of that, and you say there is no God, he says, I can't excuse that. We don't have to be scientists. Here's an illustration that will help us. You know the topography of this area because you live around here. Let's say an explosion goes off during this talk or discussion. Now, if you're like me, I'm from New York. After 9/11, you probably want to just get out of here. But let's just say the brothers go outside, responsible brothers. They say, you know what? Something did happen. The authorities are on the scene, but we feel that we can continue safely. But when you go out after the meeting, you notice that the whole topography of this area has changed. There are major highways that weren't there before, glass structures. Like when you go to some of these malls, well, you probably don't have them here in the West, but in the Northeast, we have those with the glass elevators going up and down. And you talk to the local people and they say, well, you know, explosions are going off all over America and these little malls are popping up. Here's the question, because that sounds fantastic, but would you ever accept that as truth? You may not be able to explain how those structures got there, but you know that explosions going off or bombs would never create that. And really, that's the same way or reason why Jehovah holds us responsible with this theory. It just doesn't hold up. But for the remainder of the discussion, what we're going to do is look at some of the flaws in the evolutionary model, because again, we're taking religion out of it. And we're understanding that our kids are force-fed this doctrine at school. So when we come home, it's not enough to bring them to the hall. We have to deprogram them and reason with them so that they understand they're not smart apes. One of the problems is consciousness. Consciousness. How can we explain consciousness? Well, have you ever had a dog or a cat, an animal, and you put a large full-length mirror in front of it? Maybe it's new, you bring it home, you sit it there. Normally the animal comes in and stops, right? Kind of looks in the mirror and says, okay, what's that? Doesn't realize it's looking at another of its kind in the mirror. It thinks that, well, actually doesn't realize it's looking at itself in the mirror. It thinks it's another of its kind. Hopefully you and I didn't do that this morning when you looked in the mirror. Major reason is because we're endowed with an area of our brain that helps us to be self-aware. We know that's me in the mirror, not someone who looks like me. And it allows us to understand abstract concepts. One such abstract concept is time. Before I got this outline out, I didn't even realize how just innately as humans we understand that time comes in 3 phases: past, present, future. So without thinking about it, once you get to a certain age, you take out what, right? Life insurance. Because you understand down the road you may not be here, and if you have children, you want to store up for them. Well, do you see that in the animal kingdom? Maybe, for instance, a lion proud, does the alpha male kind of say, you know, we do this hunting thing every year. We go out and get a little extra meat. You cubs don't have to do this next year. Doesn't happen that way. It's a different social order. So should we be looking to them for explanations? Clearly not. Another thing is mathematics, which is a concept we're able to understand because in essence we have this piece on our hard drive that lower animal life does not have. And something as simple as language. Animals are able to communicate, let's be clear. One sound equals one meaning, but we as humans use syntax. You may remember that word from school where we put together sounds to make words and words to make sentences. And that's why our communication is on a higher level. And if you're like me, you know that there's a scientist out there with the little chimpanzee or the ape, and he gets it to recognize the grapefruit and the orange, and he says, progress. Then they get to a certain point, can't go any further, because Jehovah hasn't given them the ability to do those things. We are literally pre-programmed for speech. In just 2 years, a baby learns a complex language just by being exposed to it. If it's more than one language in the household, they can speak them both. One man taught his young children 4 languages at once. In fact, it's interesting to me that if you study the brain, the area of the brain that processes language changes from birth to 2 years of age. After 2 years of age, it actually moves to a different area of the brain, and now you have to be taught a language. If you're learning another language, you probably have understood that. Maybe you learn it and then you don't use it for a little while and you say, what's that word again? But if from birth to 2 years of age, all you got to do is be exposed to different languages and you just simply absorb it. Is that evolution? See, because they tell us that we're supposed to absorb things in our atmosphere and get it, but we come out predisposed for language. You see why Jehovah says inexcusable to accept that as truth. Let's look again at the Bible, because the Bible's answers satisfy. Reference Genesis chapter 1, verses 20, 21, and 24. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 20 says, "And God went on to say, let the waters swarm forth a swarm of living souls, and let the flying creatures fly over the earth upon the face of the expanse of the heavens. And God proceeded to create the great sea monsters and every living soul that moves about, which the waters swarm forth according to their kinds, and every winged flying creature according to its kind. And God got to see that it was good." Now drop down to verse 24. "And God went on to say, let the earth put forth living souls according to their kinds, domestic animal and moving animal and wild beast of the earth according to its kind. And it came to be so." What phrase do you keep seeing? According to its kind, right? Now again, scientists, they try to challenge this. Hopefully you don't do this at home. But they'll take a dog and a cat, two different kinds, and they try to mate them. Do you get a smat? No. The RNA, the DNA doesn't recognize one another. Nothing can come out of that. So if you can't get a dog and a cat, two different kinds, to make anything, how is it that we came out of the primordial soup, turned from fish into reptiles that actually come onto land, get a vertebrae, stand up, turn from reptiles into mammals, and finally into man? Do you see why Jehovah says inexcusable? It may be popular in the world, but we should never accept this as truth. Not simply because it's a religious idea, but nothing in our human experience backs up this idea. In fact, since the creation period, no new kinds have come onto the scene. In fact, we have characteristics that elevate us above animals. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8, it says that God's chief quality is love, but we're able to display love, justice, mercy, and wisdom, the cardinal attributes. Here's how this plays out in this book called Love and Its Place in Nature. It says the child that has not been loved is physiologically, psychologically, and has a biochemical makeup very different from a child that receives love. They even grow differently. I don't know if you ever heard this experience about the baby in the last bed. It was an orphanage, and they were being racked by disease, and babies were dying. But even though they kept bringing in new groups, this child in a certain position always fared well. So a doctor kind of examined the situation to see what was going on, and he saw that the cleaning lady, or the person, came in at a certain time during the evening, went to this particular position after she had finished her responsibilities, picked up that child. You know what we do, goo goo gaga and all that stuff, but that actually translates into love. It stimulated that child's immune system so that they were able to ward off disease, and thus they weren't dying. So we actually need love. It's part of our makeup. In fact, if we don't get it, sometimes we're working it out for the rest of our lives, because that's simply a need. Imagine that in the animal kingdom. Some of them go away and leave their cubs or their kids for days, sometimes longer, and they come back. Try that with your kids. Well, you know the answer to that one. So here's the question. Why do we have a tendency toward wrongdoing? Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 4. There in Deuteronomy 32:4, it says, "The rock, perfect is his activity, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness with whom there is no injustice, righteous and upright is he." So we understand that we were given a perfect start. Look at verse 5 and let's see what the problem came from. "They have acted ruinously on their own part. They are not his children, the defect is their own, a generation crooked and twisted." So the Bible helps us to understand that the undesirable traits that we have are due to sin. a missing of the mark of perfection, not animal genes pulling at us or some history calling. And this is what Satan exploits, our sinful leanings. So the Bible in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 25 says, if we are living by spirit, let us go on walking orderly also by spirit. Because you and I have a choice as intelligent creatures. We're not ruled by instinct, and thus we're not connected to lower animal life. Modern evolution implies that there's no meaning, but ask yourself this: if the universe and our being alive are unplanned, what real hope is there for the future? Do the political, economic, and religious circumstances earthwide give you a positive feeling about the future? No. Yet Charles Darwin said we're going to slowly move to the point where there's no war because we're higher creatures. You can see how his theory was flawed. Let's look at our last scripture in Colossians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. And interestingly, it ties it back in with what we believe eventually comes out in what we do. See if you can pick out that connection as we read Colossians 1, 9 and 10. There it says, that is also why we, from the day we heard of it, have not ceased praying for you and asking that you may be filled with the accurate knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual comprehension. And verse 10 tells us why: in order to walk worthily of Jehovah. We simply can't do that if we don't have accurate knowledge. And so what we believe affects what we do, and godly wisdom helps us to see things from a very different perspective. Satan promised Eve freedom by abandoning God, but he actually smuggled her true freedom from her. To what do you give credit for your existence? Remember, our directions or our actions are going to affect our beliefs are going to directly affect our actions. This is far more than a religious issue. What we believe eventually is going to come out in what we do. Clear, irrefutable evidence is all around us to show that there was a creator. The complexity of life helps us to appreciate that. We should not be swindled into having our freedom taken from us. Clear, irrefutable evidence gives us the answers to these questions. So again, we ask the question, what do you believe about the origin of humanity?
Well, a round of applause, Brother Miller. We certainly enjoyed your timely discourse, a subject that could be very challenging, but we appreciate your reasoning behind it. Thank you. And certainly we appreciate all your efforts in coming from New York and being able to share with us this very spiritual, building weekend.